Evictions are surging across the country now. As a homeowner, is renting your property still a smart move, or are the risks outweighing the rewards? Now, that's what we're going to speak about in today's video. Now, not only is evictions increasing, the number of people across the country that are getting eviction notices, there is also a lot of changes and updates that's coming as far as to how much landlords can increase their rents to stay competitive in this market. And then also a lot of things just going on in Congress as far as aid and things like that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into some of the data. And I have an article here from the Real Deal Real Estate. It's a real estate news website. And I want to break down a little bit of what they're speaking about and what this means to homeowners who currently rent or are thinking about renting in the future, because we are in a market that has shifted. And with that comes changes, not only when you're thinking about buying and selling, but also, how you're able to generate income and some of the practices that you're able to do when it comes to your rental properties and things of that nature. Now, what I'm going to do is get right into that now. Illinois' rental aid shrinks as evictions pile up. Funding for eviction help falls to 50 million. Chicago ranks fourth fastest growing nationally. Um, Now, here's a little chart about some of the Midtown office market Q4 in 2024 TRD data. And if you're interested in diving into this a little bit more, I'll link the article in the description as well. Illinois is scaling back its flagship rental assistance program with funding for the next fiscal year cuts by a third, just as eviction filings are rising and rent growth shows no signs of slowing. So, one of the main reasons why this is happening, a lot of these evictions are happening, is because rental rates and pricing has been steadily increasing over the last consecutively over the last decade. And as they're stating, it's not showing any signs of slowing down. And when you have inflation that's increasing at a rate this rapidly, it is going to put consumers in a bit of a pickle. And with that, thinking about all of the layoffs and how minimum wage hasn't increased or isn't increasing as steadily as inflation is, it is putting consumers in hardship. Now, the state's court-based rental assistance initiative launched with 75 million in 2025 fiscal year will receive only 50 million in the next fiscal year, which begins July 1st. The Chicago Tribune reported. The maximum aid for eligible tenants will also be reduced from 15,000 to 10,000, although the amount set aside for court costs will increase slightly to $700. Now, the program is part of Illinois' broader Home Illinois budget, which also took a 26.6 million hit this year amid the widespread belt tightening. Now, the state officials cited fiscal constraints and federal austerity as key reasons behind the rollback. Even so, housing officials insist the program remains viable. Now, Kristen Foss, executive director of Illinois Housing Development Authority, told the outlet that the state expects to assist about 6,500 households next year, which is down roughly 8,000 in the current cycle. Now, the program stopped accepting applications this week. Tenants qualify uh, if they're facing eviction due to non-payment and earn less than 80% of area median income. Now, for Chicago, that means an annual income of a bit over 89,000 or less for a family of four. Citizenship is not a requirement, but renters must have an active eviction case and must not have received assistance in the last 18 months. Now, just to break that down a little bit, not only is this program making cuts and they're reducing funding, because of that, they were forced to stop accepting applications altogether, and they did that this week. So, anyone who is facing hardship, anytime after this week won't even be eligible to put in the application because they're no longer accepting them. And also, people who have actively received assistance in the last 18 months, they call those the repeat offenders. They're not able to receive any assistance or any aid going further. And the problem with that is people who have received that assistance in the last 18 months, a lot of those people are the ones that need it the most. Funds can be used for past due rent, court costs, and 2 months of future rent, unless a landlord refuses to participate, and in which case the state may cover 2 months at a new unit instead. So, as a landlord, if you are a landlord, you have an option to refuse to participate in this program. Now, I will say with the reason I would say with the way that this program is going, it may be in the best interest for landlords to participate in this program, but I can see why some landlords will refuse to participate because if you have a tenant that is having financial constraints and having trouble paying their bills, there has to be something there. There has to be some type of reasoning why they're having trouble keeping up with their payments. And even with this assistance, while this may help, with, a bit of some of their past due rent and also court costs which helps them, not necessarily the landlord. And then that funding can only be used for up to 2 months of future rent. So what could possibly happen, and one of the things that landlords have to keep in mind is once we get this tenant up out of the arrears and we get them back on track up to 2 months, landlords are particularly nervous as to if this type of tenant will just be back in this situation. Like what happened to this tenant financially that they're not that they were able to, get in the rears in general. And now that we've gotten them back up to date, is this something that they're going to be able to sustain? So landlords will rather get that tenant out of there and get a tenant in that's a little bit more stable because keeping that current tenant in there would come as an extreme risk for a lot of landlords. This is how they're looking at it when they choose. Meanwhile, Chicago's rent growth ranked fourth fastest among major U.S. cities in May, according to Apartment List. Rents jumped 2% month over month, well above the national average of 0.4%. Housing advocates warn the shrinking aid pool could undermine progress on preventing homelessness. Now, when tenants is in a financial situation where they're unable to keep up with their rental payments, this not only puts them in a very uncomfortable situation, it also put landlords and the homeowners in unfortunate situations as well because those missed rent payments not only makes it so that the homeowner is unable to pay their obligations that they use those rent payments to pay for, There's also legal costs for filing the eviction altogether. So it's not as easy as you like to think, as far as to getting a tenant out of the property if they're not paying, and the turnover time of getting them out and getting another tenant in to, get those rent payments back going. It is quite a bit of a burden and a headache on the homeowners. And this is something that landlords have to think about and keep in mind as they're continuously, renting out their properties or thinking about renting out properties in the future in this specific market where, there is a economic, it seems to be an economic crisis altogether stewing up. And we all know that housing is usually one of the first industries to take that hit. Now, another thing to consider and think about as a landlord, in this situation, you have to think about the property damage and the turnover costs to get another tenant in that property as well. Because usually when one tenant leaves and another tenant, you have a turnover cost to get a new tenant in there, specifically dealing with how that last tenant kept up with the property and the condition that they left the property in once you had to, get them out and get a new tenant in. And that takes time as well. It takes time, energy, efforts, and most you know importantly, it takes money. So homeowners, landlords, specifically, have to keep this all in mind, because there is a lot of cost, a lot of burden, and a lot of headache that comes with everything that's going on in this housing market. So it easily becomes a stressful situation, not only for the consumers who are going through this hardship, but also for the homeowner that owns the property. So that last article spoke more so about what was going on in Chicago, but as we know, some of the trends and some of the things that's going on in, one state, we'll also see some of those things going on in other states. It's just a matter of, how where that state falls in the order of things. So you have some states that'll be at the highest higher on the list, where it's, the numbers are a lot higher in that state, and then some states fall lower on that list. But in every state, there's usually some type of increase or some influx of, this going on. And in this article here, this speaks about Washington. And I want to go through this article a little bit too, to speak about what's going on in Washington. So, 2025 is on track to see record numbers of evictions in Washington as well. And they're speaking about this legal aid program. Also, a legal aid program for renters is struggling to keep up amid rising rents, stagnant wages, and the expiration of pandemic era protections. So, a lot of these programs are still in place from COVID. Okay. So, we have to keep that in mind. Every 4 months, Philippe Knob, the Rentry and Eviction Defense Program Director for Washington's Office of Civil Legal Aid, compiles a report on eviction trends across the state. Now, since 2021, each review has painted a worse picture than before, especially the most recent one. So, that is something very interesting to think about. You would think after the pandemic started to, dwindle down a bit, and people were able to go back to work, and people were able to, get back into a life of normacy, in some, fashion. You think that things will get better, but as they're stating here, things are actually getting worse than the pandemic, and that is mind-boggling, because pandemic, what was going on with the health crisis, it forced businesses to shut their doors, because people, a lot of businesses, had to interact with lots of people involved. And that was detrimental when you have a health crisis that was based on keeping people separated for their health. And, you know, we had no choice but to stay inside and not go out and not interact with people how we freely did, and closing the doors to a lot of businesses, or putting a pause and things in place, unless it was a essential business like grocery stores and things like that. A lot of businesses had to go on a hiatus. So it made sense for these numbers to be high during the pandemic. But just to think that now, post pandemic, things are getting worse and the numbers are much more higher and they're increasing, it really makes you wonder what is going on and how long this is going to be taking place, and what opportunities and options people are going to have to think about when it comes to this housing situation and the economic situation that we're in altogether. Now, the number of people being displaced right now is at a historic high in Washington state, said Knob. January 2025 was the single highest month we've ever seen seasonally. In King County alone, eviction filings in January 2025 were 66% higher than pre pandemic levels. It's pretty mind boggling, he said. Evictions in Washington have been steadily increasing over the past few years with no signs of slowing. The spike stems from rising rents coupled with stagnant wages, lack of affordable housing, and the expiration of pandemic era eviction protections such as increased rental assistance. Filing statewide reached an all time high in 2024, having increased by 53% since 2019, and fiscal year 2025 is on pace to surpass those numbers. Until about 6 months ago, I used to start every presentation on this topic by saying we've represented every single low income tenant who's eligible since 2021, said Knob, who oversees the state's right to counsel program. We can't say that anymore because we finally got to a point in King County where we couldn't keep up. So that's an interesting point as well. A lot of these programs, and I remember specifically during the pandemic, there was a plethora of programs available to whoever needed it in various different circumstances and situations. And as Knob said, you know, they took pride in being able to make sure that everyone was accommodated who needed, and everyone who was eligible was, and needed it, receive the aid that they needed. But now, because there's been such an uptick in, the need, they're at a particular place now where they can't keep up with everyone who's in need, in particular tenants who's eligible. So just imagine actually being eligible for programs, but there isn't space for you, or there isn't a place for you because the funding is cut and applications are no longer being received, being taken, like what was going on in Illinois. So if you look at this little chart right here, you'll see this is the statewide eviction filings in Washington between 2016 and 2024. Now, since eviction expired at the end of October 2021, violence has been steadily increasing, with the number of violence more than doubling from 2022 to 2024. Now, as you can see, you know, from 2016 to 2019, the numbers have decreased a bit. And then come 2020, the numbers decrease substantially, and kind of, bubbled around there between 2020 to 2021. And as you can see in 2022, which they're mentioning, the filings doubled. So it went from 15,000 filings to a little bit under 5,000 filings. Then it went dropped a bit below 4,000 filings, and then 2022 it jumped back to 10,000 filings. Now in 2023 that went up to 16,000. In 2024, it went up to the highest that it has been since 2016, which is up to a bit over 23,000 filings. So keep that in mind. The uptick in evictions is happening amid a record setting homelessness crisis. And that's what happens during housing crises. You have an uptick in homelessness, which is another huge problem that the U.S. has to address. Keep that in mind. With proposed cuts on the horizon to federally funded safety net programs that help low income households stay afloat. As of late May, the Trump administration plans to cut the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's rent assistance program for low income households by around 40%. And a proposal moving through Congress seeks to cut roughly 700 billion from Medicaid, which provides free or reduced health care to those with limited incomes. The cut would impact more than 600,000 Washington residents throughout the state. Now, that is disturbing. In the For the fact that we have the housing situation, and with the housing crisis, we're not only are they cutting, programs for evictions, they're cutting programs for the development of housing and urban developments. And then that makes you wonder if the administration will also begin to cut more programs like Section HUD programs and Section 8 programs. And then you have programs like Eden. And every state has different programs, and there's so many programs. But it seems to be as if a lot of these programs and the funding for these programs are cut. And that makes you wonder what that means for consumers who need housing, but also the type of situation is going to put landlords in, because there are some landlords whose business model is based on these type of programs altogether. There's a nice amount of landlords who prepare their properties, and they rent properties specifically for these programs only. And if now they are being put in situation where a lot of these programs are being cut or being defunded, that is going to push certain landlords into situations where they have to adapt to this market, and they will lose a large amount of renters available to them with all of this going on. And that is something that we need to make sure we keep an eye on. Housing advocates in Washington hope a newly signed law limiting how much a landlord can increase rent each year will help prevent evictions by ensuring renters aren't priced out of their units. Washington is the third state to implement stabilization statewide, following Oregon and California. The bill, signed into law by Governor Bob Ferguson in May, caps yearly rents increase to 7% plus inflation, or 10%, whichever is lower. For mobile home park residents, rent is not allowed to increase more than 5% in a year. Under the new law, which went into effect immediately, landlords are required to provide tenants with 90 days notice before raising rent. So to stay competitive with the market, as certain properties are eligible to increase their rents each year, long as they give the tenants a 90 day notice, and they're putting a cap on this, which is fine, but there's still a problem with that because as we're increasing rents and inflation is increasing with the stagnant wages, there's it's getting to a point where tenants are being priced out of the market still. And that is a huge problem that at some point will need to be addressed. Because if a person is living in a property and they have a certain standard of living, and then that rent goes up, even if they don't want to stay at that property and they want to rent somewhere else, well, the issue is everything else available to them would take their standard of living down compared to what they were able to afford prior to a lot of these rental increase. Now, while housing advocates are celebrating the win, which I don't really see that as a win. I mean, obviously it's nice that you put a cap on it, but it's still, I don't know if I would still be able to label that as a win. Thomas stressed there's still a long way to go to address the state's housing affordability crisis because that is another huge issue in the housing crisis, the affordability aspect of things. It's not going to keep rents affordable. It's just going to keep tenants from being price gouged, she said. There will be tenants who will get rent increases that they can't afford, and that sets them up for eviction because there's no place else affordable to move. And that's exactly why I don't see this as a necessary win. Over 30% of folks that come through eviction court identify as having a disability, he added, and over 40% are people of color. So, with that being said, let's talk about, some of the pros and the cons of, you know, renting your property in this market. And then we're going to also talk about some things that we can do to mitigate risk. So, obviously, as homeowners, the first few things that we could, that is a pro for us when it comes to renting our properties out, obviously, is the potential for the rental income being, we can use those funds to cover our costs, things like our mortgage costs, our insurance, covering the utilities and everything it comes with operating a property. And then obviously what's left over is left to be, an income or profit for us. And that's one of the things that we're doing this for. And that is what we have to keep in mind, even though with so many changes in the market, that profit margin is being threatened. And then obviously the long-term property appreciation, as we continue to hold our properties, rent them out, make an income, our property is, promised to appreciate. That's what we're told, that our property is going to appreciate, and then we're going to have equity built in. And also, this is also a protection against inflation. So as inflation occurs and our property value increases, this is something that is supposed to help us in the long run, because regardless of what the costs are and how the costs increase, if our property appreciates and rents increase, that is a great strategy for us to make more money in this economy. Now, some of the cons of renting right now in this housing crisis is obviously based off these two articles, the eviction related risk that's going on right now, the stricter regulations and tenant protections in a lot of areas currently right now. And then obviously the market volatility and the tenant turnover. I don't know, how many when there's a uptick in evictions, there's a uptick in turnover. And as we spoke about earlier, that turnover, it costs money. It costs us money. And as a landlord, it is always better to have a long-term tenant that's stable versus having to have a new tenant every 6 months or a new tenant every year, because that costs us more money. But that's kind of inevitable in this current housing crisis. And then you add to that what's going on with the defunding of these programs, and how some of these housing programs, these tenants, a lot of these tenants, because they were getting guaranteed funding, some of these tenants were staying longer. Well, now that's just not the case. And that's something that we have to consider when we decide if we're going to continue to rent our properties, or if that's going to be a liable option for us in the future. Now let's talk about some of the things we can do to mitigate some of the risk. And I hope you all, if